from the hot and humid place she traveled. So, wanting a he was not the muse that Penelope to set that even though Jake Swagger wasn't really Penelope ended up becoming the most noticeable as Hey guys, welcome to my channel. If you're new here or if you've never watched one of my videos, my name is Erica and I love books and makeup. I really love to give a great book review while I'm doing my makeup. Today's book I am so excited about. I say that every time, I know, but this book caught me off guard. It was so funny. It's by a new to me author. I'd never read any of her books before, and this book was actually recommended to me by another author who I've done a review for. I haven't made a video in a couple of weeks. I was on a week-long vacation, and then when I came back, it took me a few days to kind of get into the groove of life again. But anyway, today's book is called That Guy. No, not this guy. That Guy. It was written by an author named Kim Jones. This book was actually published on June 17th of 2018, almost 2 years ago. The reviews I've done lately are all on new release books, and I really wanted to go back and read a book that I may have missed, and I'm so glad that my author friend S.J. Tilley brought this to my attention and recommended it to me. Thank you, S.J. Tilley. I truly enjoyed this book. From what I could gather, I think that this author got quite a lot of traction when she published this book, and she even got some words of praise from Colleen Hoover, which is one of my all-time favorite authors. If Colleen Hoover gives her praise of approval, then you know that it's gotta be a good book. Today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book and the premise of the book, who the characters are in the book, and let you in on a little of what you should expect if you decide to pick this book up, and a little bit about the author who wrote it. I am ready to go ahead and put my makeup on, so let's get started. As the book opens up, you are introduced to the female lead character named Penelope Hart. And Penelope is from a small town in Mississippi who finds herself in the very cold and wintry city of Chicago. And she is on business, but it is not the usual business trip that one would take. See, Penelope made it her business to avenge the heartbreak of her best friend. Mostly because her best friend was currently taking up residence in Penelope's apartment. And being the self-proclaimed good friend that Penelope was, she couldn't exactly kick her best friend out. And also, fuck Luke Buchanan. Luke Buchanan was the one who created this mess in the first place. Penelope was going to make sure that he had a huge mess waiting for him at his doorstep. Penelope's idea was perfect, or so she thought. See, Luke Buchanan had an irrational fear of dog shit. What better way to get revenge than to set a bag of dog poop on fire outside this asshole's doorstep? Am I right? I think so. Penelope's friend wasn't joining her on this very last-minute trip, so Penelope was going to make sure to record the whole thing for all of social media to see when Luke stepped out the flames only to be met with the wafting fumes of the flamed surprise. Penelope was certain this would go viral because fuck Luke Buchanan. But Penelope's plan wasn't exactly going according to plan. Who knew that a fresh dog turd would be that hard to come by in the Windy City? She learned very quickly that the residents of Chicago were very environmentally conscious about their waste disposal. Apparently the dog owners there actually picked up their dog's droppings, unlike where she was from. So even though Penelope was ready to grab a steaming pile, several layers of bags adorned on her hand, there was no steaming piles to be found. In fact, there were no piles at all. Not until a golden retriever nearby laid one out in close proximity, and she'd suddenly found her opportunity. So with her bagged hand, she grabbed the fresh pile, not expecting the owner to be so upset about this act of kindness from her. After all, she was saving him from the job, so why get upset about it? But he was upset, and he chased Penelope and her fresh bag of crap. Seeing as Penelope had no intention of staying in Chicago after the flaming fiasco that she had planned at Luke's, she was severely low on money, and she hadn't exactly planned for the vast weather difference from the hot and humid place that she traveled from to the wintry blizzard of Chicago. So, wanting a reprieve from the cold and wanting to get away from the dog owner that was chasing her with his golden retriever in tow, she slipped into the first car she could find when she turned the street corner. It was no ordinary car, however. It was a limousine, and there was surprisingly no one in it. Penelope was suddenly relieved for having lost the dog owner on her tail, no pun intended, and that no one else was in the car, until a voice sounded from the speaker behind the partitioning window, questioning if she was Miss Sims. Shocked at the question, but not really knowing if she was exactly in the clear with the dog owner, and really not wanting to get back out in the cold, she decided to go with the flow by responding that, indeed, she was this Miss Sims in question. All Penelope knew, according to the voice from the speaker, which she assumed was the driver, was that he was instructed to pick her up after she finished shopping and take her back to Mr. Swagger's apartment. Penelope hoped that the drive would allow her to get far enough away from the angry dog owner and allow her enough time to devise a plan once she got to this Mr. Swagger's apartment building. What she wasn't expecting was for everyone involved in getting this Miss Sims to Mr. Swagger's apartment to have no idea who the lady even was. From the driver to the doorman to the concierge, everyone acted completely oblivious that Penelope wasn't this Miss Sims lady. Nor did she think that she should look like this lady, as this apartment building obviously belonged to people who could afford the luxuries of life. And Penelope was donning ill-fitted, sopping wet clothes and still carrying the bag of fresh crap. But when the concierge escorted Penelope up to the penthouse apartment that Mr. Swagger owned, she was informed that he wouldn't be back in town until the next day. So, for all her troubles, Penelope figured she'd earned a nice bath, a hot meal, and a warm place to rest before finalizing her plans at Luke's place. After all, Penelope was a romance writer, and so far, the events of the day were akin to the cliches that were found in them. She was in need of a muse for her next book, since her last one didn't do so well. And from the looks of his belongings, Mr. Swagger looked like he'd be the perfect prototype. It was almost laughable, really. Mr. Swagger. He possessed all of the material characteristics of that guy. Loaded with more money than a person should possess, an apartment that screamed masculinity, and smelled like the men she'd envisioned in her books. She just told herself that this one-night stay was all in the name of research. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and put my eyebrows on. And when I come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this book. I will be right back. I'm back and my eyebrows are done. So let's get back to the story. After Penelope enjoyed the accommodations that the full-service luxury apartment brought, she never expected to meet that guy, since he was supposed to come back the following day. But when he came home early, he was just as surprised to see her as she was him. It was not a good kind of surprise, at least not for him. To Penelope's surprise as well, Mr. Swagger definitely looked the part of that guy. And his commanding presence was just as panty-melting. But his attitude and demeanor towards her, well, that was a disappointment. Because this guy, he was an asshole. Penelope was disappointed that this guy wasn't displaying any of that typical cliche spark towards her that's usually present from the guys in the romance novels. Nope. This guy, Jake Swagger, he wanted her out of his apartment. And he was even less amused at the fact that she'd rummaged through his belongings, helped herself to his clothes and food service, and had presently made herself at home on his couch with a pizza box in her lap, vegging out in front of his TV. Oh, and she'd also left the bag of crap on his countertop. He was not the muse that Penelope had been hoping for. Nor was Penelope the Miss Sims that he'd come home expecting to find. So, after Jake kicked Penelope out of his apartment with nothing but the top hat and trench coat that the concierge provided her with, bag of doggy-doo in hand, she made good on her promise to set it aflame on Luke's front door. While the plan unfolded fairly seamlessly, with an angry and vomiting Luke getting his just desserts, all while on camera for the world to see, the cops patrolling the area that night didn't find the act so humorous. What Penelope didn't know was that area had recently had a problem with some homeless people and drug addicts, so she got mistaken for one of the homeless drug addicts in the area. She couldn't blame them. She was wearing odd-fitting clothing, a trench coat, a top hat, none of which matched the other articles of her clothing, and she got taken away to jail to sleep off her intoxication for the night. So, an unlucky Penelope, now having missed her flight home, not having any money to buy another ticket, and the cops wouldn't release her until somebody could pick her up. And since Penelope was from Mississippi and not from Chicago, she didn't know anyone in the area other than the man who kicked her out of his apartment and the one who had dog crap set aflame on his doorstep, neither of which she was sure would be amicable about hauling her out of there. But when she realized that she had one of Jake Swagger's business cards that she'd found in the pocket of the trench coat that the concierge had given her, she realized she may not have much of a choice. After she made the dreaded call, she was surprised when Jake's assistant/friend came to pick her up, looking almost as dreamy as Mr. Swagger himself. And she got lost in the thought that these romance novel cliches were unfolding right before her eyes. Because this guy, he was the perfect muse for a second book featuring her best friend. But Penelope just needed the opportunity to do some more investigating on that guy for her first book. and Jake Swagger was the perfect candidate. After all, it was in the name of research. Jake and Penelope's initial introduction to each other was not what you would expect from a typical romance novel, but each second that they actually got to know each other was filled with hilarious frustration on both their parts. Jake was annoyed with Penelope's sudden invasion of his life, and Penelope was annoyed that Jake wasn't performing all of the typical that guy cliches that she'd hoped a man that looked like him would. For all of the stereotypical broodiness that she was accustomed to from all of the men that she read and wrote about, Jake was all brood, and he seemed to possess none of the redeeming qualities that the men in the novels at least had. Penelope also learns very quickly that Jake Swagger's intentions for this apparent Miss Sims, which was also a generic name given to most of the females that he acquired, was to escort him to public events and, of course, a good time, if you know what I mean. And Jake learned very quickly that Penelope had screwed up his last arrangement when she'd made herself at home in his penthouse apartment. So Jake figured, at the very least, Penelope owed him in the form of her company at the events that he'd intended this most recent Miss Sims to attend. But he also wasn't incredibly happy about it either. To Jake, Penelope was incredibly unrefined, and she didn't seem to possess any of the class of the women that he'd usually acquired. Penelope was just a small-town girl from Mississippi with an accent to prove it. She also seemed to lack the basic knowledge of recent pop culture, manners, and she definitely didn't provide the air of sophistication in her style of dress and her lack of plastic surgery. But unfortunately, now he lacked the time to arrange a new Miss Sims before his grandfather's retirement party. So Jake's need for Penelope's quick departure from his life was put on hold for the moment. And Penelope didn't really have any pressing matters at home that she needed to attend to, so she wasn't really in a hurry to leave either. After all, what Jake needed from her meant that she could enjoy the bougie things in life for a while, and it also meant that she didn't have to go back to her apartment at home, where her best friend was still wallowing in self-pity over her heartbreak. Also, book research. Even though Jake Swagger wasn't really fulfilling any of the hero cliches of a romance novel, he was still a good muse. So she humored him in his request to accompany him, but she played by her own rules. While Jake had given her strict instructions at this event to basically keep her mouth shut and appear invisible, Penelope ended up becoming the most noticeable person in the room, and his asshole grandfather took a liking to her. Jake was quickly realizing that all of the things that annoyed him most about Penelope were also the things that made her most endearing to other people, and soon he wasn't ready to let her go. Of course, it was under the ruse of needing her to yet again accompany him to another event, but Jake was starting to realize that he also enjoyed her company, as maddening as her behavior was at times. Their physical attraction to each other grew, and while it caught Jake off guard, Penelope was not surprised at all. She was pretty confident in herself that she was a catch, and she started to believe that maybe she could be the heroine to this story. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and finish up my makeup off camera because my camera battery is about to kaputski. I will be back to talk a little bit more about this book and a little bit about the author and what my final thoughts and opinions are on this book. I will be right back. I'm back and my makeup is done. Now, back to the story. This novel is not only hilarious in its witty banter and its ridiculous shenanigans. But it was so funny to read about the humorous cliches being represented in romance novels through the eyes of, well, a romance novel. It's funny because if you read a lot of romance novels, like I do, you know how they typically go and you know how they're set up. From the meet cute to the brooding hero to the intense attraction between the hero and the heroine, right down to the pace at which their intimacy grows. And the typical conflict that generally takes place in a romance novel, you know it's usually around 75%. And even the secondary characters who were interesting and intriguing enough to warrant a spin-off book of their own. And it was funny to see Penelope point out those cliches as they happened and to poke fun of how ridiculous they seem, even though they were happening to her. They didn't always happen in the swoony ways that she'd grown accustomed to when reading about them, but they were happening. And she began to have doubts throughout her story because it all suddenly seemed too good to be true. Because no way would a guy like Jake Swagger fall in love with a poor, unrefined Mississippi girl like her. But she definitely sensed that he was, and she was terrified that she was too. This story was definitely everything that you would expect in a romance novel, but in the most hilarious and unconventional way. The author of this novel, Kim Jones, seems to be just as hilarious as the characters that she writes. At least from what I can tell by doing a little research. From what I could gather in that research, she's written about 20 books. Some of those books were co-written with other authors or were part of an anthology. But this book in particular is the most recent book that she's published. But I certainly hope it's not her last. I think the humorous take on the typical romance novel cliches that this author provided was such a refreshing take on the genre. And I think readers who indulge in that genre can really appreciate the honesty in regard to those cliches. I think the story was definitely out of the realm from what this author typically writes about. What I found when I did research on her, it looks like her novels prior to this one were mostly revolved around motorcycle clubs and bad boy bikers. This author does reside in Mississippi, and I feel like the main character in the story is probably a lot of the author. This author definitely seems like a really fun, hilarious person, and I kept telling myself while I was reading throughout the story that I could totally be friends with Penelope and indulge in the shenanigans with her. I think this author is a great writer, and this book was the first of hers that I've read, but I'm honestly immediately a fan. I'm sure that the other books that she has written do have some of that humorous banter that she was so prominent with in this story. The way that this story ended, it kind of left it open to the possibility of a second book with the secondary characters, but I kind of think maybe that's just a ruse because yet again she's kind of poking fun at the romance genre in general and how they typically lead to spin-off books in a series, and maybe this was just one final laugh at all of the typical romance genre cliches. This book was not available on Kindle Unlimited. I do know that she has some books on Kindle Unlimited, but this book was not. It was $3.99 and I purchased that through Amazon and read it on my Kindle. This author gave me no incentive to do this review. She doesn't even know that I'm doing this review. I just genuinely loved this book so much, and I don't see how anyone could read it and not love it just for the laughs. And I just think that some of the things that came out of Penelope's mouth were insane, and it just made for a very entertaining read. I hope that you guys read this book. You know I wouldn't lead you astray. I only recommend the books that I truly loved and that I truly enjoyed, especially if I'm prompting you to purchase it. I stand behind my 5-star review for this book and urge you to read this book. I hope you like this video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you want some good book recommendations and you like makeup, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will continue to give you my best book recommendations. I will list all of the makeup products that I used today down below in the description box in case you're interested, and I will also list a link down below where you can find this book on Amazon and help support an author. If you read this book, don't forget to leave a review. Leave me a comment down below if you have a good book recommendation for me, and I would love to take your suggestion. Thank you guys so much for watching. Without you guys, I wouldn't do what I do. And I love this, so I hope you do too. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. You guys stay safe out there, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!